so part two of Rome, of the Romanesque. Sorry, I already made the mistake. I called it Rome. So some key things that I want you guys to make sure that you guys take away from the understanding and our discussion of Romanesque architecture. So these are things that you're likely to get asked questions about. And what I did is I tried to put a bunch of stuff kind of on one page. Okay, so Romanesque architecture is predominantly Christian buildings, not classical Roman buildings. All right, please remember that. It is an architecture of rounded arches and vaults, not the pointed ones. The pointed ones are coming next week in Gothic architecture. So it relies very heavily on small unit masonry. So we're not talking about gigantic stone blocks that are being quarried. We're talking about things the size of a brick. Okay, there is stone involved, but the ability to quarry large stones is sort of gone. The idea of ribbed vaults. So remember, a vault is essentially an arch that's been stretched out. Okay, a barrel vault. But the idea of a rib vault, which has ribs that essentially strengthen the vault, is another one of the things that you'll see repeatedly sort of visible in this type of architecture, along with this idea of a buttress thickened wall. Okay, and we'll look at a picture of buttresses as we kind of go through this section right here. There was a distinct move away from timber and wood roofs, right, due to the fact that these other materials provided greater fire resistance. There is in most cases, an austerity, a sort of simplicity or plainness, lack of ornamentation of most of the exterior. Now that's not always the case, but when you compare it to later movements or earlier movements, either the earlier Roman movements or the later Gothic movement, you're going to see that the exteriors don't have anywhere near the level of ornamentation. Okay. The next thing is that the interiors, despite the fact that they're trying to make the nave taller and they're trying to punch more windows, are relatively dark compared to later forms of Gothic architecture. The idea of growth in the congregation size is requiring larger and larger naves. Another thing to remember is that there are going to be regional variations. So the Romanesque of Germany is going to be somewhat different from the Romanesque of France versus the Romanesque of Spain versus the Romanesque of England. Okay, but there is still enough consistency to be able to identify the type. A lot of times, many of the Romanesque structures are going to be located outside of cities, out in the country. Okay, and that's because they were most often affiliated with the establishment of a monastery. Another thing that's not written up here that's important for you guys to understand. A lot of things change in 1,000 years, right? And so some of these buildings would take a long, long, long time to build. And in the middle of building it, somebody would come up with some new idea. And so it's not uncommon to see buildings that have one sort of way of building on one side and a completely different way of building on another. It's also not uncommon to see buildings that get completely renovated, either on the exterior or the interior or both. And so there are cases where you could walk into one of these structures and on the outside it looks Baroque or it looks High Renaissance or it looks Gothic, and yet on the inside it has all the characteristics of a Romanesque structure because it started out as a Romanesque structure. One other thing that's not up there that's important to understand is that idea of the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage has a huge impact on the shape of the nave and the side aisles and this thing called an ambulatory. Okay? All right. So let's take a look at some of the elements of Romanesque architecture. So this next set of slides, there's probably 15 or 16 of them, are all pieces, okay, of Romanesque where you need to understand and remember the kind of name of things and what it does, okay? All right, so the first thing that we're going to look at is called an applied or engaged column, okay? And it's a column that is either applied to the surface of a larger, more square wall behind it, okay, or it's a column that's actually pushed into a wall behind it, all right? And we looked at those early on when we looked at the architecture of Egypt and Zoser's sort of funerary complex. Remember there were those columns and there was a wall attached to them? So it's in some ways it's sort of like that. If it was flat, it would be called a pilaster. Another thing that we've already kind of approached is this idea of an arcade. An arcade is a space that's created by a series of columns and arches, okay? And it defines essentially a pierced wall, because a long row of columns creates a distinct area on one side versus the other side, and yet you can walk through it and you can see through it. It's not the same as a wall, okay? One thing we talked about last week was this notion of an atrium, and the word atrium comes from the Greek atria, which means open to the sky. I learned that from a Greek teacher that I had at Cal Poly years ago, Spiros Amorgis. In early Christian churches, like, for example, Old St. Peter's, there was this open courtyard up at the front where people that were not members of the congregation would sort of come and wait. This next piece is called the Narthex. All right, and now the Narthex is one name for many things, but it's essentially the entrance to the church. Okay, and in the case of the Narthex, most of the time it's sort of a porch of sorts. It's outdoors, but you'll see that later on there are going to be churches that have a Narthex that's not necessarily outdoors. And there are other names for the entrance to a church. So, for example, in German Romanesque buildings, there was this thing called the Westwork or Westwerk, which is an entrance area that was wider than the nave and side aisles. So you notice down here that it's sticking out past the side aisles, and there's the nave. All right, and the Westwork in German architecture was often linked to this idea of the tower, the vertical tower. All right, and oftentimes you'll see buttresses associated with that. Another way of referring to the entrance to the church is the west end or the western end. Christian churches have the entrance to the church facing west, and I should say, if you think about the position of Western Europe in relationship to where Jerusalem might be, right? Is Jerusalem to the north of Europe? No. Is it to the south? A little bit, but it's mostly south and east, mostly east, okay? Because remember, the Mediterranean kind of angles over. And so the idea was that the end of the church where the altar was would point towards the east, towards Jerusalem. Okay? So that brings us to the east end of the church. And the east end of the church is where the main altar is usually placed. There are areas at the east end that are intended to be separated from where the congregation normally goes. We're going to talk about this thing called an apse, which we've already talked about when we looked at the Roman Basilica, the Basilica of Constantine. But the end of the church most often was some sort of an apse or an apsidal form. Okay? Okay, now the sort of interior layout of a church. That tall central section where people would go and sit for Mass was called the nave. Okay? What word does nave sound like? think of a branch of the armed forces, the Navy. And that is because the people that initially built the trusses for the churches were essentially the shipbuilders. If you think about it, if you take a ship and you turn it upside down, you have that sort of domed arch. Okay, and so that's where that tall initial or that tall centralized space comes from there. Directly adjacent to the nave are the aisles or the side aisles. And the side aisles come in different configurations. They can be a single side aisle, they can be a double side aisle, even a triple side aisle. They can start as a single and go to a double and go to a triple and enlarge as they go back. Remember that there was an effect of those many things that we looked at in as far as impacts on the shape of the building, right? And one of those things was the notion of the pilgrims. And so the pilgrims were coming to these churches and going through the churches at the same time that all of the other liturgical functions were going on. And so the relics and stuff were often kept in small chapels, right, that are directly adjacent to the spaces where people walk. We talked about this in last week's lecture, the notion of a transept that creates the Latin cross. So the transept is the part that bisects the nave. It crosses it at a 90-degree angle. Okay, and the transept is generally a place where it's subdivided into smaller chapels. So there'll be a chapel in each of the transepts or some other function that takes place there. In this particular case, what you're looking at here is a transept where there could be 2 additional chapels, and then adjacent to that you see 4 apsidal forms, 2 on each side. Those in turn could be another set of even smaller chapels. So there's this modularization of space that we talked about earlier that is part of what we see in Romanesque architecture. The crossing is where the nave and the transept cross. Now it's important to kind of understand that there's a difference, and the difference is 3-dimensional. Remember that the nave is very tall and the side aisles have a roof that's down lower. I have a slide coming up that'll sort of explain that. The idea of the crossing, right, being this lofty space that has the dome over top of it is kind of this pointing to heaven in ecclesiastical architecture of this period. There is, in some churches, this idea of a choir, and no, it is not where the choir sits. Okay, the word choir comes from it, but the choir is where there were elements and portions of the liturgy that only the clergy would access. Okay, and so there was often a division there, and so I've got to probably stop this so I don't go over my limit. So I'm going to pause, or I'm going to stop this, and then we'll keep going with the next one.